want to read this excerpt from a Carlos Castaneda book. I believe it's The Active Side of Infinity, if I'm not mistaken, where this quote comes from. Don Juan, the Mexican Yaqui Indian shaman, tells Carlos Castaneda the following in this excerpt. Quote, "We have a predator that came from the depths of the cosmos and took over the rule of our lives. Human beings are its prisoners. The predator is our lord and master. It has rendered us docile, helpless. If we want to protest, it suppresses our protest. If we want to act independently, it demands that we don't do so. I have been beating around the bush all this time, insinuating to you that something is holding us prisoner. Indeed, we are held prisoner." This was an energetic fact for the sorcerers of ancient Mexico. They took us over because we are food for them, and they squeeze us mercilessly because we are their sustenance. Just as we rear chickens in chicken coops, the predators rear us in human coops, humaneros. Therefore, their food is always available to them. Carlos Castaneda replies to Don Juan, No, this is absurd, Don Juan. What you're saying is something monstrous. It simply cannot be true. For sorcerers, or for average men, or for anyone. And Don Juan responds calmly, why not? Why? Why not? Because it infuriates you? You know, that's why it can't be true? You haven't heard all the claims yet. I want to appeal to your analytical mind. Think for a moment and tell me how you would explain the contradictions between the intelligence of man the engineer and the stupidity of his systems of belief, or the stupidity of his contradictory behavior. Sorcerers believe that the predators have given us our systems of belief and our ideas of good and evil, our social mores. They are the ones who set up our hopes and expectations and dreams of success or failure. They have given us covetousness, greed, and cowardice. It is the predators who make us complacent, routinary, and egomaniacal. But how can they do this, Don Juan? Carlos asked. Somehow, angered even further by what Don Juan was saying. Do they whisper all that in our ears while we are asleep? No, they don't do it that way. That's idiotic, Don Juan said, smiling. They are infinitely more efficient and organized than that. In order to keep us obedient and meek and weak, the predators engage themselves in a stupendous maneuver. Stupendous, of course, from the point of view of a fighting strategist. A horrendous maneuver from the point of view of those who suffered it. They gave us their mind. Do you hear me? The predators gave us their mind, which becomes our mind. The predator's mind is baroque, contradictory, morose, filled with the fear of being discovered any minute now. I know that even though you have never suffered hunger, you have food anxiety, which is none other than the anxiety of the predator who fears that at any moment now its maneuver is going to be uncovered and food is going to be denied it. Through the mind, which after all is their mind, the predators inject into the lives of human beings whatever is convenient for them, and they ensure in this manner a degree of security to act as a buffer against their fear. The sorcerers of ancient Mexico were quite ill at ease with the idea of when the predator made its appearance on Earth. They reasoned that man must have been a complete being at one point with stupendous insights, feats of awareness that are mythological legends nowadays. And then everything seems to disappear, and we now have a sedated man. What I am saying is that we have against us not a simple predator. It is very smart and very organized. It follows a methodical system to render us useless. Man, the magical that he is destined to be, is no longer magical. He is an average piece of meat. There are no more dreams for man, but the dreams of an animal who is being raised to become a piece of meat, trite, conventional, and imbecilic. That's from Carlos Castaneda's The Active Side of Infinity. And while Don Juan there might be putting out a very dark worldview, I would ask people to listen to what he's actually saying there. That a predator that is not part of us has come from the depths of the cosmos and took over this place, took over the rule of our lives, and they did it by the stupendous maneuver of infecting us with their mindset, with their worldview, with their ideology. Our mind is now working as their mind. We are taking up their ways. We have taken up their ways. They gave us, he says, they gave us our systems of belief. They gave us our systems of belief. All of our religions, all of them. Not just some of them, all of them. They gave us the monetary system. Okay? They gave us the slavery system called government. And yet we propagate it because we have their same mindset. Very, very, very difficult for people to hear. Don Juan didn't want to, Carlos Castaneda didn't want to hear it from this wise man. He didn't want to hear it. And Don Juan asked him, why can't it be? When Carlos Castaneda says this is absurd, it can't be true, he says, why not? Why can't that be true? Because you get mad at it? So you're the arbiter of truth of what happened here in the ancient past, long before you were born? See, this is where people's mindset that won't look at possibilities that may have occurred. I'm not telling you have to accept it as gospel truth, but if your mind is closed to the possibility that something here happened in our ancient past that we are loath to accept and understand because of how uncomfortable it is, we may never understand our true origins if that's our mindset. We may never understand what put us in our current condition, in our current mental condition, first and foremost. Now, what created all these disorders, these genetic disorders and defects in the human genome? Human beings have over 4,000 specific genetic disorders within the human genome. No.
Saturday, April 8th, 1962. In our conversations, Don Juan consistently used or referred to the phrase man of knowledge, but never explained what he meant by it. I asked him about it. A man of knowledge is one who has followed truthfully the hardships of learning, he said. A man who has, without rushing or without faltering, gone as far as he can in unraveling the secrets of power and knowledge. Can anyone be a man of knowledge? No, not anyone. Then what must a man do to become a man of knowledge? He must challenge and defeat his four natural enemies. The enemies a man encounters on the path of learning to become a man of knowledge are truly formidable. Most men succumb to them. What kind of enemies are they, Don Juan? He refused to talk about the enemies. He said it would be a long time before the subject would make any sense to me. I tried to keep the topic alive and asked him if he thought I could become a man of knowledge. He said no man could possibly tell that for sure. Sunday, April 15th, 1962. As I was getting ready to leave, I decided to ask him once more about the enemies of a man of knowledge. I argued that I could not return for some time, and it would be a good idea to write down what he had to say and then think about it while I was away. He hesitated for a while, but then began to talk. When a man starts to learn, he's never clear about his objectives. His purpose is faulty. His intent is vague. He hopes for rewards that will never materialize, for he knows nothing of the hardships of learning. He slowly begins to learn, bit by bit at first, then in big chunks, and his thoughts soon clash. What he learns is never what he pictured or imagined, and so he begins to be afraid. Learning is never what one expects. Every step of learning is a new task. and the fear the man is experiencing begins to mount mercilessly, unyieldingly. His purpose becomes a battlefield, and thus he has stumbled upon the first of his natural enemies, fear. A terrible enemy, treacherous and difficult to overcome. It remains concealed at every turn of the way, prowling, waiting, and if the man, terrified in its presence, runs away, his enemy will have put an end to his quest. What will happen to the man if he runs away in fear? Nothing happens to him except that he will never learn. He will never become a man of knowledge. He will perhaps be a bully or a harmless, scared man. At any rate, he will be a defeated man. His first enemy will have put an end to his cravings. And what can he do to overcome fear? The answer is very simple. He must not run away. He must defy his fear, and in spite of it, he must take the next step in learning, and the next, and the next. He must be fully afraid, and yet he must not stop. That is the rule. And the moment will come when his first enemy retreats. But won't the man be afraid again if something new happens to him? No. Once a man has vanquished fear, he's free from it for the rest of his life. Because instead of fear, he's acquired clarity. A clarity of mind which erases fear. By then, a man knows his desires. He knows how to satisfy those desires. He can anticipate the new steps of learning, and a sharp clarity surrounds everything. The man feels that nothing is concealed. And thus he has encountered his second enemy, clarity. That clarity of mind which is so hard to obtain dispels fear, but also blinds. It forces the man never to doubt himself. It is like something incomplete. If the man yields to this make-believe power, he succumbs to his second enemy and will fumble with learning. He will be clear as long as he lives, but he will no longer learn or yearn for anything. But what does he have to do to avoid being defeated? He must do what he did with fear. He must defy his clarity and use it only to see. The moment will come when he will understand that his clarity was only a point before his eyes. He will know at this point that the power he's been pursuing for so long is finally his. He can do with it whatever he pleases. His ally is at his command. His wish is the rule. He sees all that is around him, but he has also come across his third enemy, power. A man at this stage hardly notices his third enemy closing in on him, and suddenly, without knowing, he will certainly have lost the battle. His enemy will have turned him into a cruel, capricious man. Will he lose his power? No, he will never lose his clarity or his power. Well, what then will distinguish him from a man of knowledge? A man who is defeated by power dies without really knowing how to handle it. Power is only a burden upon his fate. Such a man has no command over himself and cannot tell when or how to use his power. Well, how can he defeat his third enemy, Don Juan? He has to defy it, deliberately. He has to come to realize the power he has seemingly conquered is in reality never his. He must keep himself in line at all times, handling carefully and faithfully all that he has learned. Thus he will have defeated his third enemy. The man will be by then at the end of his journey of learning, and almost without warning, he will come upon the last of his enemies, old age. This enemy is the cruelest of all, the one he won't be able to defeat completely, but only fight away. But if the man sloughs off his tiredness and lives his fate through, he can then be called a man of knowledge, if only for the brief moment when he succeeds in fighting off his last invincible enemy. That moment of clarity, power, and knowledge is enough.
Don't give a hoot about these whack-ass trouts, son. Y'all think he can spit, but y'all straight trash, son. Y'all can't put up numbers like me, son. Y'all bunch of whack-ass bitches, son. Straight up, son. Three rock shits all over y'all, son. Yeah, son. 10 racks. Shit, mama just screaming dumb, son. Straight up, son. On the wrist, pop out the red blue big, son. Oh, yeah. Let's fuck up some trout. 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 Yeah. Get bread. Get cheddar, I get bread. Get cheddar, I get bread. Get cheap, I get yeah. Let's fuck up some trout. 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 Yeah. Cheddar, I get bread. Get cheddar, I get bread. Get cheddar, I get bread. Get cheap, I get dead. Trout. Yeah. Let's fuck up some trout. Yeah. Let's fuck up some trout. Yeah. Cheddar, I get bread. Get cheddar, I get bread. Get cheddar, I get bread. Get cheap, I get yeah. Let's fuck up some trout. 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 Yeah. Cheddar, I get bread. Get cheddar, I get bread. Get cheddar, I get bread. Get cheap, I get yeah.
Well, let's see here. I think what we have to do is think in terms of the exhaustion of our own cultural forms. I mean, that's what we're living through, is a global dying created by the exhaustion of our cultural forms and the vitality of the cultural forms that we see in these so-called primitive, I call them pre-literate people. As Nicole pointed out, they have nothing. But what they seem to have that we cannot seem to get a grip on is a kind of dynamic equilibrium with their environment and peace of mind in the felt experience of the moment. These are the two things we don't have. As a society, we cannot seem to make peace with nature. As human beings, as individuals, it's very hard for us to be at peace with ourselves. I mean, I consider my own life the search for peace of mind. Forget enlightenment, forget shunyata, all of this stuff. You know, just a little peace of mind would be a tremendous boon as far as I can see. So I really think that there's a confluence here of themes and possibilities. It has this richly plotted texture that always lets you know that you're in the presence of a higher order of things. It's that the shamans whom we admire, who we idealize, are seen to be at the center of this environment, the warm jungle, the tropics, the warm tropics, that we find it necessary to destroy. So it's a perfect image of us being at war, not only with ourselves, but with nature itself. And you know, you've heard all about how the Amazon and the Congo Basin in eastern Indonesia are all being cleared and lumbered and turned into cattle ranches. This is a tragedy, obviously. We understand and can perceive the dynamics of that. But how to make sense of a situation where, as the World Bank and the IMF attempt to halt this kind of destruction, on the other side of the coin, the United States State Department and the DEA and these agencies propose and are planning to carry out the defoliation of the Waijaga Basin. So there's a schizophrenia here that is not academic. I mean, are we trying to get the patient well, or are we pulling the plugs one by one? We seem to be acting in both dimensions simultaneously. And I think it's because we have not in this culture awakened to the depth of the crisis that surrounds us. there's a lot of kind of self-congratulatory backslapping going around these days over the fact that communists everywhere are in hot water and have to admit that they did it wrong. And this gives a lot of satisfaction to people who feel that that means we did it right. We didn't do it right. They did it wrong and now admit they did it wrong. We do it wrong and have yet to even raise the possibility of turning away from what we are doing. The internal contradictions of Marxism were based on a false definition of what people are. People do not respond to central planning, hortatory propaganda, and stereotyping. Neither do people respond to an ethos of self-denial or a view of human beings that denies the fact that we have certain itches which must be scratched. So, I think that the collapse of Marxism is only the collapse of the outer edge of the societal and civilizing assumptions that we have made. After all, Marxism is nothing more than the millenarian retread of Christian millenarianism. And so is modern science, yet another secular retread of Christian millenarianism. So our culture is in trouble, not trouble. We are at a terminal crisis, a bifurcation it can only go one of two ways. Horror beyond your wildest imagination, or breakthrough to dignity, decency, community, and caring beyond your wildest imagination. Now, where do you look for models? Where do you go? The answer is so obvious. You go to nature. Nature has been playing this game for 3 billion years on this planet. We have been playing the game, we, the apostles of Christian scientism, for about 2,000 years. Nature has an economy, an elegance, a style that if we could but emulate it, we could rise out of the rubble that we are making of the planet. It was the geographer Carl Sauer who said, man found the planet a climaxed primeval forest. He, and notice the gender here, he will leave the planet a weedy lot. A weedy lot. Well, now this is a metaphor where you change climax rainforest for weeds, but it's also true. By clearing land, we promote the kind of plant evolution that stresses very rapid seed production and annular cycles of growth. In other words, weeds. And this tendency to find perfection and then to leave rubble in our wake has haunted us for the past 3,000 or 4,000 years of our history. Now, with the ozone shield disappearing, with acid rain falling on the earth that can melt blocks of marble, with the CO2 levels rising, with the levels of strontium and chlorofluorocarbons, and the litany, we have now one last chance to fish or cut bait. And the place where nature has provided the models for how to respond to this situation is the climax rainforest. Only the climax tropical rainforest has the kind of complexity of signal transfer, movement of nutritional materials, movement of electromagnetic radiation that we find in the modern city. It is a cliche of modernity that the city is a jungle. The problem is it isn't jungle enough. And I think it's the task of the new shamans to take the metaphor of the jungle, which is a metaphor of tremendous wealth, tremendous variety, a tremendous outpouring of form and of energy and of potential fulfillment of various bifurcation patterns of flow, to take that and enrich our own lives with it. And the way this is done is by empowering the presence of experience. The main thing that you get with these so-called primitive pre-literate people, and with people like Nicole, who have spent time in this situation, is they are in the moment. They know how to have fun. They know how to work. They know how to live. And the reason they understand this is because they are focused within the confines of the felt presence of experience. They do not live by abstraction. And abstraction is the knife poised at our hearts. We are so much the victims of abstraction that with the earth in flames, we can barely rouse ourselves to wander across the room and look at the thermostat. That's the level of disimpassioning that abstraction has laid upon us. Well, hopefully this weekend there will be passion there will be an effort wherever there is abstraction to drag it down into the felt presence of the moment. I think basically what we are a kind of green anarchy, an effort to revivify social forms that have been atrophied in the West at least since the destruction of Eleusis, probably in most places thousands of years before that. This is our last chance. I have done the best I could in terms of trying to sift through all these options and, as a communicator, offer the best way out. And, you know, I could only do my best. And so that's what you get. I can't preach scientism because I don't believe in it. I can't preach Buddhism because I can't understand it. The only thing I can preach is the felt presence of immediate experience, which for me came through the psychedelics, which are not drugs, but plants. It's a perversion of language to try and derail this thing into talk of drugs. There are spirits in the natural world that come to us in this way. And so far as I can tell, this is the only way that they come to us, that it's rapid enough for it to have an impact upon us as a global population. This weekend will be different because we will be hewing close to the source. Nicole is a priceless repository of information, more even than she knows. If I could declare her a national treasure, I would. The number, who knows what this woman knows? Who knows how much human suffering, the alleviation of how much anxiety lies in the hands of perhaps half a dozen people of Nicole's caliber who have paid their dues in these jungles. This information is flowing through our fingers and disappearing. In another 30 years, it will be all gone. Every time I go to the Amazon, I can feel the way in which it's slipping away. When my brother and I go off looking for these unusual hallucinogens, often we have the experience where when we finally find the person who claims they know what we're after, the line goes like this. Well, I've never taken it, but as a child, I remember seeing my grandfather prepare it, and I think I can do it. If it weren't for us standing there asking that it be done, it would never have even risen into the gentleman's mind as a possibility. This is the knife edge upon which this knowledge is poised. If it can be saved, it gives me hope that we can be saved. If we can't save this kind of knowledge, we cannot save ourselves, because this kind of knowledge is ourselves. Culture is a garment which you put on. Medical systems are pieces of jewelry which you wrap around your throat or neck. Religious ideals are like objects which you push through pierced nostrils and earlobes. If we cannot come to terms with that which allows us to give birth with ease, to die with dignity, and to live in health, then what kind of a future do we have? No future at all. So this is not a meeting of obscurantists or enthusiasts for some private vista of transcendence. This is a meeting of political activists, people who are socially committed to themselves, to each other, to the larger idea of community, and who understand that when you talk about Gaia, it's only an abstraction unless you talk about plants. The division between the masculine and the feminine is only trivially a difference between men and women. It is fundamentally a division between plants and animals. Plants are the enveloping feminine matrix of control and refurbishment. Animals are something invented by plants to move seeds around. An extremely yang solution to a peculiar problem which they face. So the archaic revival, if it means anything, it means reconnecting the Gaian mind, which is a vegetable mind, a feminine, enfolding, boundary-dissolving, planetary mind that is not an abstraction, not a stereotype, not something used to create hortatory propaganda, but a living, breathing reality, a reality which is the only thing which stands between us and Armageddon. History is a kind of horrified realization that something has been lost, that there is an itch hard to scratch in the civilized context, that we have, out of fear, really descended into patterns of domination of each other, of the environment, of our children, of our social relations with exogamous groups, we have descended into a dominator pattern that is basically based on clutching, on fear. And I'm sure most of you have heard me argue that this is the consequence of ceasing basically to do enough hallucinogens in the diet. That, in fact, what human beings were flirting with over many, many tens of millennia, let's say from 100,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, human beings were in a flirtatious situation with a symbiotic relationship with this mind resident in vegetable nature. Now, you all know that what classic symbiosis is in biology. It's where, let's take the example of the little fish who lives in the sea anemone, and big fish don't bother it. It gains protection. The sea anemone gains access to larger prey, which come to investigate the little fish. That kind of symbiosis is genetically locked in. And if you take the little fish away from the anemone and put it, let us say, in an aquarium without anemones, it doesn't die. It doesn't go into an immediate physiological crisis. No, what happens is it simply has a low body weight and a short lifespan. In other words, it is under stress. And I believe, I hope I'm not deluding myself, but I believe that the lost secret of human emergence, the undefined catalyst that took a very bright monkey and turned that species into a tormented, self-reflecting poet dreamer, that catalyst has to be sought in these tertiary alkaloids in the food chain that were catalyzing higher states of intellectual activity. And I pointed out to you ad nauseum, I'm sure, the reciprocal feedback relationship that was working there. In the case of the mushroom, in the veldt situation in Africa, it was promoting at low doses visual acuity, which was feeding back into the hunting and gathering process, making those animals with this increased visual acuity more adaptively successful, hence more reproductively successful, hence they're outbreeding their competitors. At higher doses, psilocybin actually causes a generalized arousal, which includes sexual arousal. Again, it becomes a catalyst for increased reproductive success. More instances of copulation in a situation like that lead to more successful births of those into family structures where the alkaloid has been accepted into the food chain. Well, this would be only an obscure topic of interest to primatologists were it not for the fact that it is a crisis in consciousness which confronts us globally. Consciousness is the commodity that if we do not have enough of it, do not produce it fast enough, then the momentum of the processes we set in motion in our ignorance is going to sterilize the planet and do us all in. So we have to have consciousness. Well, then you look at the smorgasbord of ethnographic possibilities and you discover this institution of shamanism. It is the institution of planner, of visionary, of manager, of large system coordinator. That's what it's about. You call it magic on one level, you call it curing, you call it folk psychiatry or weather prediction. Shamans have been involved in all of these things. But as Nicole was made so eloquently the point last night, to these deep forest people, it is ordinary. It is ordinary. They live in a different cultural dimension than we do. Dimensions which to us are completely value dark are to them completely transparent. And dimensions which to us are extremely rich and complex, the inner world of the nucleus of the atom, let us say, are for them totally value dark. They don't even cognize the possibility of asking the question. But nevertheless, the specialization in these various domains is not something where one is as good as another. Consciousness is the domain of immediate experience. How are we going to save this planet? How are we going to take the lethal cascade of toxic, technological, and ignorance-producing habits that are loose on this planet and channel them toward some kind of a sane and livable world? Well, the answer is emerging in culture out of the collectivity of global consciousness. It is what I call the archaic revival. It is this very large turnover in the mass mind. Some people call it a paradigm shift. It's an effort to recover the sensory ratios, the feelings, and the attitudes of 15 to 20,000 years ago, before fear, before ego, before male dominance, before hierarchy, hoarding, warfare, propaganda, child abuse, all of these things. And the answer lies, as was indicated last night, in integration into the dynamics of nature. Well, as far as my analysis gives it to me, the only way you can abandon yourself to the dynamics of nature is to break through the language shell. You must cut through the aura of programming and cultural assumptions that surround us from the moment we are able to speak. The only way this can be done is by dissolving the boundaries of ego. Ego is a structure that is erected by a neurotic individual who is a member of a neurotic culture against the facts of the matter. And culture, which we put on like an overcoat, culture is the collectivized consensus about what sort of neurotic behaviors are acceptable. Now, I don't know. So you see, what I see going on in the Amazon is a very radical psycholytic therapy where they are dissolving, literally dissolving the boundaries of self, culture, and ego assumption. And then what you discover is not the white light, or what William James called the blooming, buzzing confusion, although in the first few minutes it can be like that. But what you really discover is sentient, organized, living, loving nature. That nature is a force. Nature is a mind, a personality, organized with intentionality, organized with feeling, humor, grace, and conviction. Conviction. And if you can get right with that conviction, then that's the secret of dancing in the waterfall. That's the secret of the shaman's apparent transcendence of the rules of mundane statistics. Because that is what it is. The shaman doesn't violate physics. He or she simply knows how to push the improbable to its greatest extent. And in Eastern philosophy, this is called the Tao. Abandonment to the flow, fitting of the small pattern into the larger pattern. Well, I think these things are very important because I think that psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis is a good idea, but it will never reach any kind of operational effectiveness until we look to these native healers all over the world and study their methods. And their methods are chemical and personal. It's a combination of care, attention, intention, and chemistry that allows consciousness to be made malleable and then recast in other forms. So I find myself this weekend explaining myself. That's what I feel like I'm doing. Why does someone who extols the self-transforming elf machines of the DMT space also claim to be a conservationist, also, have a mathematical dog and poodle show? Well, it's because all of these things emerge out of the concrescence of consciousness, its intention toward its own transformation. Nature is the answer. It's not enough to be like Wordsworth. It's not enough to, this is not, Mao Zedong said the revolution is not a dinner party. And certainly the ecological revolution is not a dinner party. Poetic sensitivity to the depth of the planet is not what we're striving for here. What we're striving for is to halt, overturn, and back out of the impending death of the planet. It is very clear now that consciousness will decide that the planet, there are not rosy futures of suburban housing and ratatouille to be extended endlessly into the future. We are approaching a bifurcation where it is either going to become heaven or hell, one or the other. And I think that this archaic intuition, which I see reaching clear back to the birth of the 20th century and the 19th century, back to people like Alfred Jarry and Guillaume Apollinaire and the pataphysicians, the surrealists, the physicists around Einstein, Freud, modern art, modern dance, jazz, all of this stuff is an effort to reclaim the primitive, to reclaim the archaic, to reject all that powdered wig algebra that comes down through the French, English, German tradition of constipated male dominance. And instead, intuit, that's what it is in Freud and Jung and the New Age, intuit our way out. But now we're close, the intuition is rising to the surface. We no longer have to operate without the presence of the goal firmly in hand. The goal can now be stated. What this is all about is a return to archaism with the lessons learned in history. That's where we were happy. The fall was a fall into a veil of tears, into a world of limitation and pain and suffering and infectious disease and so forth and so on. It's a prodigal journey into a lower dimension that can now be ended by a collective cultural decision to commit to this Taoist, shamanistic, feminized, cybernetic, caring, aware, present kind of being. I mean, it's nothing more than what each of us is in our very best moments. But we have to extend those very best moments to fill whole lifetimes. Think of the number of people who suffered and died that we could sit under this tree this morning. I mean, in the last million years, 9 times the glaciers have ground south from the poles, freezing the world into ice and confining human populations to subtropical valleys and the warm tropics. 9 times the interglacial periods have come and human populations have spread out over the earth. They didn't have radio, they didn't have antibiotics, contraception, statistical analysis of a partial differential equation, and yet somehow they managed to get us here. Are we then, as the heirs of that wavefront, of the inheritors of a billion-year process, are we in one generation to turn it into a massive pottage? I think not. I certainly hope not. I would like to believe that we could make that leap to conscious awareness that would allow us to take hold. Now, the problem, it was easy the first 10 years that I sat before you, because what we were doing was getting to know each other, to verify that we in fact existed, that I wasn't crazy, you weren't crazy, so forth and so on. Now, what looms ahead is the mess of politics. And this, I'm sure you have no stomach for. I certainly don't. I'd rather be stoned and rocked in the arms of the goddess. But as a matter of fact, this dominator thing is not going to be unhooked and put to bed without a struggle. Everyone is going to have to be counted. I've talked to you in recent months about memes. Memes being the smallest potential units of ideas. They're like genes. We are the nucleus of a mutant meme. The meme of plant consciousness, hallucinogenic consciousness, shamanistic consciousness. We have to refine this meme, replicate it through repetition, and spread it through society in the same way that a plant sheds seeds into an ecosystem. The idea will compete. The idea is a good one. It's adaptive, it's clever, it's tough, it's invasive, it can make use of many contexts to promote its own existence. But we can't do any of that if we don't replicate it and get it out. So these molecules are planar. That means they're flat, they're simple, sometimes 20, 30 atoms. And yet, they totally transform your entire consciousness. This is the equivalent of a red ant who can rip down the Empire State Building. And these molecules are planar. That means they're flat, they're simple, sometimes 20, 30 atoms. And yet, they totally transform your entire consciousness. This is the equivalent of a red ant who can rip down the Empire State Building in an hour and a half. I mean, why is mind so delicately poised that such a tiny amount of pharmaceutical material can create such vast changes? And then another puzzle, as long as I'm listing my favorite mysteries. And this is the one that really got me into this in the beginning, because my early inclination was toward art history. And that is a very simple question. Where do the images come from? Where does this stuff come from? I mean, it is so unreferent to the ocean of commercially produced imagery in which we swim. You know, we are constantly bombarded by the images of television and Hollywood and so forth and so on. And yet the psychedelic species of visual beauty is not, we don't see it in our furniture styles and our architecture. It seems to be coming in literally from another dimension. And yet it is undeniably moving. It's beautiful. And I am puzzled why I, as an ordinary person, under the influence of, let us say, 30 milligrams of psilocybin, can see more art in an hour than Western civilization has produced in the past 1,000 years. And that tells you how little of we're getting from the Orange River back to the village where we can drink it. Niagaras of beauty are flowing by, untapped by ordinary consciousness. And, you know, would that we could send robots who could film these psychedelic realities. Perhaps, you know, virtual reality will develop into a technology where we are able finally to reconstruct and agree upon the content of the psychedelic experience. But to me, that's almost like the metaphysical stamp of approval on the psychedelic experience. Beauty is the presence of so much beauty is an argument to me that truth cannot be far away. Yeah.
Trips without plants?
Well, you know, there's a whole vast area of human endeavor called mystical religion, and there's a whole other vast area of human endeavor called madness. And many stories abound and come out of these areas. I think that what we're talking about here, whether we're talking about madness, mysticism, or psychedelics, is a brain state. For the schizophrenic, it is uninvited and terrifying. For the mystic, it's achieved by excruciating acts of asceticism in most cases, which certainly have profound physiological consequences on the neural ecology of the brain. And for the smart money, I think you use a shamanic technology. I think religion, organized religion of the high classical sort, you know, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, is very anxious about this whole issue, precisely because religion is always anxious about the issue of direct revelation. That was what shattered religious consensus in Europe. That's what the Protestant Reformation was about, doctrinally. There were many things going on. But the doctrinal argument was, is it the job of specialists called theologians to study scripture called revelation in order to tell the rest of us what God's plan is? Or is it better for each of us to look within the confines of our own souls and have our own dialogue with God and figure it out? And that was basically the Protestant position that went against hierarchical theology. Yeah.
I recently read about a mushroom called fly agaric. Can you comment on its role of history?
Oh, these are amazingly complicated questions. So either that or I've overeducated myself. Could be, huh? Well, there is a whole domain of controversy and discourse about the role of mushrooms in human culture, because it was noticed by Gordon Watson in the 1950s that there are invariably, there are two kinds of cultural attitudes toward mushrooms. One is called mycophilic. And if you want to know what mycophilism is, go to Russia, go to Poland, go to Czechoslovakia, where people have hundreds of words for mushrooms. Several holidays a year are set aside to collect mushrooms. Children are named after mushrooms, so forth and so on. The Slavs are into mushrooms. Well, then if you want to know what a mycophobic culture is, go to rural England, where there are no mushrooms. There are only toadstools, and don't touch them, please. They're highly poisonous. That's the general English attitude toward mushrooms. So Gordon Watson wrote about this all through the 50s and 60s, and he decided that you all probably have seen, if not the real thing, a plaster cast or depicted in schmaltzy European illustrative style, the famous mushroom of fairy tales, the red mushroom with the white dots. Well, that is Amanita muscaria. and it grows in a symbiotic mycorrhizal relationship to spruce and birch trees, and is used by the shaman of the Yakut language group and the Amur River Basin. And now it just happens that those people in the Amur River Basin were the first people studied by the new science of anthropology when it wanted to study shamanism, by chance. And so ever since, the science of shamanism, whether we're talking about the shamans of the Amazon Basin, Central China, South India, or Tierra del Fuego, has had to labor within the categories created by the people who study the shamanism of the Amur River Basin. And the use of the Amanita muscaria was tremendously overstressed by Watson, I think. He wrote a book called Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality, in which he argued that Amanita muscaria was the Soma of the Rig Vedas. You may not know it, but the Rig Vedas are largely these hymns composed in the Vedic phase of the Hindu religion to a mysterious intoxicant, Soma. Nobody knows what Soma is, but much scholarly ink and blood has been shed on the question. And Gordon Wasson argued that it had to be Amanita muscaria and made a case which impressed some people and not others. The most damaging evidence against him was it's hard as hell to get off on this stuff. And when you finally do get off, the experience is extremely ambiguous. I mean, shivering and salivating and thinking you're losing your marbles is not my idea of the ecstatic sense of the presence of the aroma. A lot of other people thought so too. So then there was lots of hassle about, well then, it did seem that Watson had secured the case that the Vedic hymns were about a mushroom. That was his breakthrough. But his mistake was he got the mushroom wrong and then created an entire false cultural history based on this error. And this, I'm not interested in flaying you with my theory, but if you're interested, it's told in the book Food of the Gods. Because, as I mentioned this morning, I think psilocybin was the catalyst that triggered the emergence of self-reflecting consciousness in human beings. And so my mushroom story is not a story of a subarctic toxic mushroom cult that carried itself into India along with the Indo-European invasions. My story is an older story about a mushroom that contained psilocybin and flourished in the grasslands of Africa and was present as nomadism slowly evolved into the domestication of cattle. And as we talked about this morning, the suppression of gender dominance with the addition of psilocybin in the diet created a partnership society that existed up until the invention of agriculture, and climatological change made the mushroom difficult to obtain. And at that very critical juncture, after perhaps 50,000 years of mushroom-induced suppression of hierarchical dominance patterns, the withdrawal of the mushroom from the human diet allowed the old pattern to reassert itself. But at this point, we had language, we had agriculture, and what did we do? We quickly organized monotheistic religions, city-states, warrior castes, god kingship, the world of the lash, and the god king, basically. And we are the unhappy inheritors of that circumstance to the present day. And that's why our situation is so bizarre and why we are so neurotic, if you will. It's because human consciousness evolved in an entirely different cultural milieu than we now exist in. It evolved in a world in which the Gaian logos was absolutely real to every man, woman, and child in society. And I believe that the tendency in the hominoids to form monogamous pair bonding was eroded by the presence of psilocybin because it promoted an orgiastic sexual style. And the social consequences of that were that men could not trace lines of male paternity. And so you have an intense impetus toward collective bonding in a group like that, because the children are our children, the children of the group. The nuclear family is, I think, a somewhat maladaptive fragmentation from all of this. And this is important for us to understand because we have practiced a neurotic style of culture for a long, long time. It has permitted the conquest of matter, but that now is done. I mean, once, hydrogen fusion, you can put it in a bottle at Yale, well, then you've been there, done that. And now we have to swing the thing back into balance. The tools that we acquired on the journey of the prodigal son through the world of matter, you cannot redeem the moral cost of that, and yet unless those tools are brought to bear to now redeem the planet. I mean, if there is any justification for history at all, it must be that it secured a longer evolutionary life for intelligence on the planet. And as far as how the psychedelics fit into this in the individual scheme, psychedelics are not flashlights into the chaos of the Freudian unconscious. They are tools for mathematically unpacking your mind into a higher dimensional space. In the Newtonian and pre-created social space that we're walking around it, you are like a self-extracting archive that hasn't self-extracted itself yet. And then you take psilocybin and you self-extract and unfold. And because think about it, I mean, I'm very serious about this. Think about what the shaman's functions are in the classical Paleolithic model. The shaman's functions are to predict weather, to anticipate the movement of game and enemy, and to heal disease. Well, now, how could you do those three things? Well, the answer is, if you could see into next week, that would be helpful. That would allow you to do all three of those things. Predict the weather, see the movement of game and enemy, and make very astute choices about who you accepted as your patient. You see? And so what we see here is that there's a kind of selection going on for an ability to triangulate complex systems into the future. And I think that now the reason the psychedelic experience is so compelling to me is because I took psychedelics for years with the question, what is it? And then I never could understand what it was, and it's the wrong question, and on and on. But finally I realized, I see what it is. It's everything. It's, that piece of doggerel, I saw eternity the other night, an endless golden ring. Well, that's it. You just rise out of the Newtonian spatial plane, and you look back, and there is eternity hanging in space like a galaxy. And that's what the psychedelic experience is, a section in it. Well, if that which is most familiar to me can generate something completely unrecognizable to me, to call it the self is to betray the notion. So what I've called it over the years, from the very, very beginning, I can't even remember how long ago we incorporated this nomenclature, is I called it the other. And, the German historian of religion, Rudolf Otto, defined God as the wholly other, the wholly and totally other, he said. This is somewhat like Nicholas Cusanus's theology of the late of the 14th century, where he said God can only be defined by negative statements. God is not this, God is not that. The wholly other. And the experience of DMT seems to be that. And I don't know if it's just that we are neurologically set up, that there's a button in us, the equivalent of a reset button that just clears all the registers. And that's why it's wholly other. It's wholly other because you just dumped your entire memory load off your disk. And you're now looking at a clean disk for the first time in your life and you don't have the faintest idea what it could possibly be. It's something like that. Language fails. Anticipation fails. And naturally, because we have this sort of metaphysical openness in our ideological systems, we identify this wholly otherness with God, with the transcendent force in our lives. And so it seems to be. Can I remember some things that it said? Well, first of all, yes, this idea of an other that you can relate to. It's interesting, it's fascinating how if you really go to bedrock with these things, there's some really interesting Christian theology that relates to all this. The existential theology of Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard said the defining relationship in life is an I-thou relationship to Christ. And the I-thou relationship, and Martin Buber made a great deal of this as well. So it's a profound thing to relate to an other, even if that other is an other human being. It's still, an abyss of ambiguity. I don't know who you are, where you came from, what your agenda is, what your plans are for me, whether they're casual or intense, and so forth and so on. So then, meeting an other that is not a human being, that is somebody who sits up in your mind and says, "Hey, big boy, what's cooking?" It opens up the possibility for a relationship, and it can be explored. And I always thought, that you could somehow trap it, that it was sort of like a game in a fairy tale, that if you were clever enough, you could have asked a series of questions where you would then have trapped it into revealing, so you are my amygdala, so forth and so on, this kind of thing. I have never, in the presence of the thing, been able to do that. As far as what it has said, basically it's told me everything I know. As far as boiling it down to the aphoristic level, you've heard these all through the years. Death by astonishment. All the best lines come from the thing itself. And I mean, my talent seems to be that I'm able to relax and allow this very ingratiating logos to take over. It's a kind of low-key demonic possession from the point of view of my critic. To speak about this other way of looking at things. In terms of what it has said to me, it's this revelation about the nature of time. And it's a puzzling revelation because it's mathematical, it's formal, it will either be proven spectacularly true or spectacularly false. There is no escaping this incredible definitive test built into it. It's not something I would ever have thought of. And it's just something I was given. And I was sort of at a dead end. I mean, I was a good person to give it to. I didn't really have a job in life. And it's like a talisman or a key. You meet people who are into astrology, and for them, it opens up all doorways. Everything can be explained, and I'm not belittling it. I'm making an example of it.
We're talking about the whole other.
Right.
We're talking about one of the things that happened to me in my early experiences with DMT was that I was totally in awe. I was flabbergasted. And until I stopped being flabbergasted and paid attention, I didn't get that they were signaling me to do something.
Oh, yeah.
They wanted me to participate in what was happening, rather than just sit there and go, wow.
No, they say to me, do not abandon yourself to amazement. Don't give way to astonishment. I mean, try to hold it together, fella, which is a strange thing to be being told by an alien entity inside a hallucinogenic flash. It's not encouraging you to let it all go. It's saying, pay attention. And then in my case, what they're trying to do is they can make things out of sound, or their words are three-dimensional modalities. They're operating in a linguistic domain where words are sculptural entities made of life, and they're singing objects into existence, which are like puns or mathematical formula or small machines that are cycling through various kinds of changes, and they're singing this stuff into existence and insisting that you attempt to do the same, And, this is so startling that you have to understand these trips only last 3 to 5 minutes. There's not a lot of time to get used to this. I mean, there you are, sitting in a room with your friends, talking about consciousness, exploration, whatever rhetoric you use to get yourself to the edge of these things. You fire up the pipe, you take one enormous hit, and the next thing you know, you're surrounded by screaming elves, by the hundreds that are speaking in this alien language that is causing objects to hang in the air and ricochet off the wall. And these things come, it's a scene of wild confusion. It's like a Bugs Bunny cartoon running backwards. And these things come bounding up, and they say, look at this. And out of the air, out of their guts, out of nowhere, they pull objects, which are the most astonishing things you can imagine. Literally the most astonishing things you can imagine. Jewels, filigreed, machines, turning things. And you look at it, you say, anybody from my planet looking at this would not have to be told what this is. This is an alien artifact. And you look at it and they say, forget that, look at this one. And then here's another one. And they're tossing them up. And meanwhile, the objects themselves are able to sing other objects into existence. And there is this aura, the word zany comes to mind. It's like a Max Sennett comedy or a Marx Brothers cartoon. I mean, it's a land of explosions and falling animals, and surprises are popping out of everywhere, and you're just trying to hang on. So now we're at we're a minute and a half into it at this point, and this intense effort to communicate something. And we have talked in the past. We can talk now if you want. Celtic fairyland, tradition, will like being known than else, but when you're there, it doesn't look like that. It's much more pointed ears, shining eyes, strange machine. It's much more off planet. I mean, we're not seeing leather jerkins and pointed-toed little boots and the plucking of fairy hearts. It's not quite like that. Yeah.
Children who seem to experience the phenomena that you're talking about, these people who come into conventions in the middle of the night and communicate with them. Children aren't.
Well, I think this is where the abduction thing is coming from. That I don't know what these entities are. When you burst into the DMT place, there is an incredible sense of place. And yet, the things that you're witnessing matter.
So, like, what people think is an alien abduction is actually, they're just getting a DMT burst when their system at night produces it. So they got a flash of, a high peak of a DMT burst. And so they thought that they were like getting abducted by aliens when actually they were just on a high peak of a DMT burst. And we're seeing the elves that are all around us at all times.
There is not capable of any matter. I mean, aliens can be what thing is coming from. That I don't know what these entities are. When you burst into the DMT place, there is an incredible sense of place. And yet, the things that you're witnessing, matter is not capable of any matter. I mean, aliens can be one thing. They can have tentacles, they can do this, that, and other thing. But when there's no defined form, then you say, you are like an idea, I say to the entity. You are like an idea. You have no defined form. You're continuously amorphous. And, it then replies, yes, I am who am, or something like that. It's the face of the abyss. I mean, I've had conversations with it where after, a more zany episode where you then begin to feel a little confidence with it. And then you say, well, show me what you are for yourself. What are you really? I can tell that you're coming to me through a series of filters and presentations and masks. What are you really? And it's like the temperature falls 10 degrees in the room and a black curtain begins to rise and there's an organ note like that thing in the Bach B minor mass. And after about 15 seconds you say, call it off. I'm not ready for it. Let's go back to the little fuzzy bunnies and the alien invasion scenario, but I'm not ready. And then it's just very obliging, says, okay, you asked for it. But so there is the sense, of what is this? I don't know. I think that that this is the most important fact about our situation on this planet. And it's discovered over and over again over the past 100,000 years that there's somebody else, something else, somewhere else here. And anybody who says they understand it is bullshitting. The Theosophists don't understand it. The Catholics, the Kabbalists, nobody understands it. But it is real. And I don't know what it means to find this out. You see, the amazing thing about psychedelics is it doesn't depend on a state of grace. It doesn't depend on allegiance to a leader. It doesn't even depend on a special diet or theological predilection. The astonishing news about these psychedelic experiences is you don't have to go to India for 10 years. You don't have to be chosen by Babaji. This works for most people and would probably work for you. And if you think the world has no surprises, if you think that you've got it all figured out and you haven't ever had an intense boundary dissolving psychedelic, then you're absolutely out of line. You don't know what's going It's like the opinions of 11-year-old boys about sexuality. You know, what do they know that they should hold such opinions? And, you know, sexuality provides a good metaphor. We cannot forestall our sexuality. You know, eventually the roar of obelisk, nobody understands it. But so there is the sense, you know, of what is this? I don't know. I think that this is the most important fact about our situation on this planet. And it's discovered over and over again over the past 100,000 years that there's somebody else, something else, somewhere else here. And anybody who says they understand it is bullshitting. The Theosophists don't understand it, the Catholics, the Kabbalists, nobody understands it. But it is real. And I don't know what it means to find this out. You see, the amazing thing about psychedelics is it doesn't depend on a state of grace. It doesn't depend on allegiance to a leader. It doesn't even depend on a special diet or theological predilection. The astonishing news about these psychedelic experiences is you don't have to go to India for 10 years. You don't have to be chosen by Babaji. This works for most people and would probably work for you. And if you think the world has no surprises, if you think that you've got it all figured out and you haven't ever had an intense boundary dissolving psychedelic, then you're absolutely out to lunch. You don't know what's going on. It's like the opinions of 11-year-old boys about sexuality. You know, what do they know that they should hold such opinions? And, you know, sexuality provides a good metaphor. We cannot forestall our sexuality. You know, eventually the roar of hormones through the bloodstream pushes most people over the edge, some sooner than others. This capacity for the psychedelic experience, which is built into our soma, our body, as well, you can actually go from birth to the grave and never experience it. If you are sufficiently sold out to a sufficiently idiotic culture, then it's possible to evade this experience of maturation. It's like having a Mercedes and there's a certain button on the dashboard and you never pushed it. You don't know, you know, what it did. Because, and yet it's as profound as sexuality, it's as profound as the forming of relationships, the birthing of children, birth, death. This is the thing. And many, many religions have come to the conclusion that life somehow needs to be a preparation for a passing on to some other place. And the metaphor of light vehicle is used in many different traditions. And I think that there is some truth to the notion that the reason we are alive is to learn the path out of the labyrinth. And that shamanism is a rehearsal for death. All this talk about hyperspace and other dimensions and eternity, you know, what we're really talking about here is the cultural and personal enterprise of leaving the body behind. Oh yeah, let me do that. Well, it's simply that we share this planet with some other kind of entity, and culture is a way of sealing us off from this fact, which children are not fully acculturated. Children are barbarians of some sort. And then as they become acculturated, their invisible companions fade away and they become as dreary as the rest of us. The abduction phenomenon, I think, is simply an inability to tell the difference between dream and memory. Dream is the fascinating dimension, and I don't demean these experiences by associating them with dream. I think that probably when we fully understand DMT, we will realize that every night in deep sleep, most people go to the meltdown place and actually experience a DMT trip. But the essence of the core of the DMT trip is you cannot remember it. A really good DMT trip has a part always in the center where you do not lose consciousness. You are conscious while it's happening, but you can never, ever talk about that part of the trip because within 20 seconds of its ceasing to be the present, it's gone. It lays down no mystery.
That's for damn sure.
And that's the moment where you really find out what's going on. They show you, you get the hyper-Masonic initiation of the local Galactarian lodge at that point. But then you come out of it and you have no trace of it. You have the sense of having been in the presence of the aroma. But what that means, you have to think of. Yeah.
I'm curious about a common element from person to person with people in some way that, for example, you talk a lot in conflict about your experience with these self-replicating machines.
Right.
And I never met them myself, but other people, I know they were bad crystal keys, but there's some experience that the people like a crystal ball coming down from the left and like intuitive and just trying to pass it to the other fish. I'm wondering if you have experience with a lot of people found common elements that show up in entities or whatever.
Well, my approach to that is sort of Jungian, and I've talked to a lot of people who've done DMT and tried to build up a composite image of what is happening. And a great deal, it has a lot to do with what you bring to it, your past education and experience, obviously. And it has a great deal to do with just your descriptive powers and your ability to stay calm. I mean, some people just go nuts and yell for it to end and carry on. From talking to a lot of people, the archetype that rules DMT, I would say, is the archetype of the circus. And think for a moment. The circus is about a focus on a well-lit central area filled with chaotic activity. First of all, the clowns. And the clowns are the self-transforming machine elves. They arrive in their tiny car, and 15 of them get out, and they have big noses and rubber shoes, and they dance around. Clowns. But in the DMT thing, there is a weird and very strong erotic component. And I believe from my own work on myself that I became aware of Eros. I wouldn't say had my first erection, but maybe the first one I was ever conscious of or something like that, in the presence of a lady acrobat at a circus wearing a tiny spangled costume and hanging by her teeth way up and I got it. Death and Eros and this incredible dynamic. So you have the clowns, the death and Eros thing at the circus, and then you have this kinky undercurrent, which is the sideshows. The rat-faced boy and the thing in the bottle and the two-headed lady and all that. Just off the main ring, folks, the hoochie-coochie dancers and all that. And then when you think about the concept of the circus generally, you realize it's a perfect metaphor for DMT. Because I grew up in a small town in Colorado where every 1st of July, the carnival would come to town. And we were told we couldn't stay out after 9:30 at night playing when the carnival was in town because these carny people, they were just a different stripe, some of them probably drank heavy. They were racially questionable origins and so on. And they brought immense excitement to this little town, unpacked their wonders, built their Ferris wheels and rides, bilked all the rubes of their cash, and packed it all up and went away. And of course, every kid worth his salt wants to run off with the circus. And, Ray Bradbury in his book, The Circus of Dr. Lao, used these motifs. Fellini in his films over and over again. Circus is a motif for the unconscious. So over time, and I've had people say, very interesting things. I saw a woman do a subthreshold trip on DMT, and unprompted and never having heard this rap, when she came down, she said, it was the saddest carnival I've ever been to. She said all the rides were closed and there were just those little square ice cream pickers blowing in the wind and getting caught up, and I was the only person there. Well, that's about as down a DMT trip as you can have. And basically, as you do more of it, you just dial it up until, it becomes Barnum and Bailey Ringley Brothers, and then it goes on to become the Star Wars bar, and then it goes on to become something from which English cannot even begin to wrap itself in. But I think that's the archetype.
All right, then. Peace. Peace out. Thanks for joining me. Flat Earth SubGenius, fess up. Out. It's flat.
I'm here to prove that